I would like to begin by thanking the organizing committee for this wonderful opportunity and for the exhibition itself, the experience, which is an experience the likes of which I'm unlikely to see again. I would also like to give particular thanks to Pietro Marani, who I see arriving now, whom I've known since the early 1990s, when he gave so very kindly of his time to deal with the naive inquiries of a much younger me, when I began to work on paintings by various Leonardeschi, in particular a couple of works by Giampietrino. It really is remarkable and quite humbling to consider the journey that's led from that point to my being here today. And so today I can't help feeling in some ways like an imposter. It's because the extraordinary expertise of Pietro and so many other scholars gathered here today has given me so much insight over the years. So by that standard, I certainly don't feel like an expert on Leonardo. It's the nature of the conservator's work to immerse oneself deeply in a subject, sometimes for years, and then move on, often to works from other countries and centuries. I've recently been spending a lot of time in 17th century Amsterdam and 16th century Rome, for example, which is a promiscuity that may shock some of you. However, I have been fortunate enough to keep a lot of engagement with the maestro thanks to the generosity of colleagues, which has allowed me to follow important treatments and research undertaken in France and Italy since our work finished on the Virgin of the Rocks in 2010. This recent work, more than anything else, makes it so interesting to reconsider our activity with a fresh eye. We're all fortunate that now it's a given we have a wider cultural responsibility to link technical and historical research to any significant conservation treatment of a work by Leonardo, to extract as much meaning from it as possible. And of course, the most influential model of this approach is the heroic treatment and study of the Last Supper, undertaken by Pinin Brambilla and Pietro Marani, which example we and others have followed, especially my colleagues in Paris and at the Opificio. I think the net result of these several treatments undertaken since then has done a great deal to satisfy what Cecilia Frosanini has described as the need to bridge the gap between Leonardo as an artist and the character created by the urban legends. And of course, the truly satisfying thing to note is that even as the gap has narrowed, our wonder at his artistic achievement is in no sense diminished. And now I think I should start my PowerPoint. Let's see. So for me, it's very satisfying to see how comfortably the National Gallery treatment tradition of interdisciplinary collaboration sits within this wider practice I've described. And so I'll now summarize that method as applied to our work on the Virgin of the Rocks. The restoration campaign took place from late 2008 till mid-2010. The decision to undertake such a cleaning was driven primarily by aesthetic considerations. The varnish, which was applied in 1948, was highly unstable, consisting of mastic in turpentine with a significant amount of linseed oil. And on top of that, a thick layer of microcrystalline wax was applied. This varnish had yellowed a great deal, though not disastrously so. More problematic, however, was the fact that cracking in the varnish and dirt, which had become stuck in the wax, had seriously compromised the ability of the varnish to saturate the picture properly. As a result, it was impossible to really understand the sophisticated handling of the range of tonal modeling from light to dark, which is perhaps the single most distinctive or important quality of the picture. So, if the restoration's practical intent was directed toward our visual experience, it was also the end point of many years of study, both of this work and several paintings made by Leonardo's associates and assistants from within the gallery's collection. Therefore, I'm representing the work of several colleagues from the conservation, curatorial, and scientific departments undertaken over many years, all of whom have been involved in research, analysis, and restoration of relevant paintings. My closest collaborator was undoubtedly the painting's curator, an organizer of our Leonardo exhibition, Luke Sison, but I'll also be drawing in particular on the work of Ashok Roy and Rachel Morrison in the analyses of materials and layer structures, and I'm similarly indebted to the infrared research undertaken by Luke and Rachel Billinge. The recent treatment is the latest in a long series of movements and treatments undertaken since it was made. The story of the commission is a topic in its own right, but I think I should give the barest outline. The work was commissioned as part of a larger ensemble by the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception at San Francisco Grande in 1483, probably resulting in the completion of the picture now in Paris, which painting seems not to have been installed, but gone or sold elsewhere. There's a broad consensus that the National Gallery version was begun around the mid-1490s to replace it, and was probably installed unfinished around 1503. Leonardo was away from Milan between 1501 and 1506, and upon his return, the project seems to have been restarted, with the work being considered finished enough to receive its final payment in 1508. The picture remained in Milan until 1780, when it was purchased and brought to England by Gavin Hamilton. It passed through 2 more English collections until it was acquired by the gallery from the Earl of Suffolk. Its popular panel was thinned and cradled by Morel shortly after acquisition. Fortunately, the panel has remained stable, and the application of that cradle has not caused subsequent structural problems, particularly since air conditioning was introduced in the gallery. There may have been some thinning of the varnish at about this time. We have references to removal of varnish in connection with treating the surface, but a more comprehensive cleaning was not undertaken until Helmut Ruhrmann's treatment of 1948. The varnish that he removed, of which he left these 3 small dark brown squares on the edges of the painting, was found to contain mastic, damar, fir balsam, and heat-bodied linseed oil. This complicated mixture of materials indicates probably that more than 1 layer of varnish was there, and that the bulk of the material Helmut Ruhrmann removed was applied before the painting came to the National Gallery. As we've seen, the composition of Ruhrmann's varnish led to its rapid degradation. However, his documentation of his treatment was unusually thorough for the time, and there exist dozens of detailed photographs from that period. These have proved vital in the recent treatment. The treatments also benefited from new information discovered through non-invasive imaging methods, including X-radiography, digital photography, infrared photography, and the results of image processing those records. The pre-restoration imaging work also provided a major and unexpected discovery, the existence of a wholly different initial composition, one with strong associations with other drawings and paintings from the early 1490s. Infrared reflectography revealed a significant part of an image of a kneeling virgin, her right arm extended, her left hand resting across her breast, a pose which resonates strongly with the sheet of designs for a nativity or adoration, now in the Metropolitan, sketches which before had not been related to any surviving autograph painting, as well as an adoring virgin within a sheet of architectural studies now in Windsor. This first composition probably began on the panel as a brush drawing directly on the gesso, which reinforced some sort of schematic indication transferred from a cartoon, and was then elaborated in a more free manner above a thin gray and prematura layer, which had been applied over the first drawing. This is a technique characteristic of Leonardo for developing the initial transferred design that you can see in the unfinished St. Jerome, a figure whose pose also recalls that of the underdrawn Virgin. The St. Jerome had more often than not been dated to the early 1480s, but its links to this first hidden composition of the London picture suggested that it too belongs to the early 1490s, because the London painting has even stronger associations with 2 other Milanese works which can be firmly placed in the early to mid-1490s, the portrait of Cecilia Gallerani and the Last Supper. I say this because the Virgin's left hand is based on a reversed image of Cecilia's right hand, while the design of her head is also reversed and accurately enlarged in the head of St. Philip from the Last Supper, both heads ultimately deriving from a sketch at Windsor. So the study of the underdrawing has therefore helped us to sharpen our ideas about the dating of our painting, but it also raises important questions about the functioning of the studio. The evident use, recycling, rescaling of whole or partial cartoons suggests something of the diverse activities of a busy workshop, and it leads us directly to the important question of the nature and degree of collaboration involved in the execution of a painting like the Virgin of the Rocks, a collaboration which is explicitly described in the painting's contract and is in fact a fundamental issue in consideration of many paintings produced in Milan. The cleaning of the painting was begun in November 2008, and as you can, the sequence shows, did not result in a dramatic shift in color relationships. I'm just going to run through a few images, but produced an appreciably improved saturation of the darker tones. This gave a much clearer understanding of the range of modeling, the volumetric forms, and the spatial relationships. The intent of the cleaning was to achieve this improvement through the reduction of the old varnish, but not by simply removing it. A thin remnant of the old varnish remains on the painting, as you can see in this ultraviolet photograph taken during the course of cleaning. Looking back, I think it's interesting to note here the fundamental similarities with cleanings subsequently undertaken in the Louvre and Italy, and not just in the fact that some varnish has been retained. In all cases, cleaning is conceived in terms of the visual effect that is sought and obtained, and not primarily in terms of what was removed. So maybe Anglo-Saxon cleaning isn't always so Anglo-Saxon. A selective approach to some of Ruhrmann's old restoration underpaints was also taken, some of which were left as a basis for subsequent retouching. And to talk a little bit about the painting technique, the panel was prepared conventionally with a layer of gesso, over which a light warm gray imprimatura was applied in 2 layers. The lower layer, mostly lead white and black, the upper layer with a little bit of lead tin yellow. The binding medium of the imprimatura was identified as untreated walnut oil. The imprimatura was probably extensively smoothed and patted with the hand, since you can see finger and palm prints in the X-radiograph that they're not in the main paint layers, although they give some texture to the paint layers. They're only in the priming, and that's exactly as described by Vasari about 50 years later for applying imprimatura. The fluid underdrawing of the abandoned composition was done directly on the gesso. Several cross-sections show a thin layer containing carbon black particles in a brown matrix below the imprimatura. Subsequent drawing layers are also seen in cross-section above it, as in the upper sample of the 2 you see here from the yellow lining of the Virgin's mantle, while you can find drawing also in between the 2 applications. This may be what we're seeing in these details from Christ's arm, where a thin yellow layer clearly passes over the drawing lines of the second composition. The question of how the drawing may have been elaborated from the cartoon transfer both above and below imprimatura layers is especially complicated because of that abandoned first composition. It could be the second imprimatura was applied after the first layer just to reduce the presence of that first composition. Anyway, it's quite difficult to decide when drawing stops and painting begins in Leonardo in general. The way in which the drawing develops gradually into a tonal, almost monochromatic translucent brownish underpainting is one of its most notable features. It's the kind of underpainting with the character of a fluid wash-like drawing which we see in the unfinished Adoration of the Magi, and now see much better than you can see in my old slide. And of course the St. Jerome. And once you know about that and have your eye in, you can see parts of the National Gallery really never taken much beyond that stage. So the vegetation and rocks immediately above the Baptist. You can also see this phase of the execution in many of the cross-sections taken from across the London picture. So you see this brown layer below the flesh paint of the Baptist's right foot, part of the tonal modeling. And you can also see the brown tonal modeling below the finished blue mantle of the Virgin. And I think it's this underpainting, this highly developed tonal modeling is what's really responsible for the unity and convincing modeling that makes the picture so striking, whatever the colors that were applied later happen to be. Now, since there'd been very few published examples of analytical studies of Leonardo's paint medium at that time, it's a subject we looked at in as much detail as we could. At the time of our work, only one painting had been given a thorough analytical investigation of its binding media, and that is the Alta Pinakothek's Madonna with the Carnation, where the Derner Institute proposed some very intriguing explanations for the typical drying defects and ultramarine degradation, which is all too apparent in their work as ours. Leonardo's painting poses particularly interesting questions, given that so many of his works exhibit severe wrinkling, cracking, and shrinkage associated with poor drying. The scientific department confirmed, however, that the imprimatur layers and the majority of the paint layers were applied in walnut oil, but some parts, like the gray underpaint of the Virgin and the mauve-brown underpaint of the angel's drapery, were done in heat-bodied, or probably partially heat-bodied linseed oil. So anyway, the research suggests that the materials he used are quite conventional for Italian painting of the period, and so the defects we see are probably more about overly thick application and inadequate drying times, particularly where he's using pigments that are inherently poor dryers like ultramarine, brown, and black. So it's about his application rather than using unusual or experimental media. So the deterioration of the Virgin's ultramarine mantle is particularly disturbing because it occurs in one of the most richly colored parts of the entire picture. The surface glazes of ultramarine, which are applied over fairly unchanged azurite, are rough textured and broken up, and there's evidently irreversible loss of color in the blue pigment itself. And so the most serious problem of interpretation is the partial loss of the modeling of the folds of the fabric, which now are relatively flattened and formless, and that, of course, poses some very interesting retouching problems. A red lake pigment has been used in two parts of the picture, which ought to be mentioned. In the Virgin's tunic, you can see it mixed with a bit of lead white and black over a gray underlayer. It's quite hard to read that structure because the upper layer of paint is now very broken up, and you see much more of the underpaint. A similar mixture was used in the mauve underlayer of the angel's blue drapery. This part of the painting has suffered more damage than anywhere else in the picture, and after we removed some of Ruhrmann's less successful retouchings, the underlayer was exposed in several large paint losses, you can see here. So it's pretty smashed up. Cross-sections from both areas show similar characteristic rounded particles which exhibit strong blue fluorescence in UV light. We did imaging on the cross-section from the angel's drapery and showed that these particles were some form of starch, and so we could take spectra in FTIR from the data and compare them to spectra of starch. And it seems that the damage which has occurred where this pigment is used is related to the fact that starch is such a principal component of the pigment. It seems to make the paint inherently vulnerable, perhaps from its hygroscopic response to changes in humidity. Anyway, it's striking that the only parts of the picture that really are substantially damaged with paint loss, the top layer of the Virgin's tunic and the underlayer of the angel's mantle, are exactly those bits with the highest concentrations of the starchy red lake. And it's the earliest example we know where starch has been identified in a red lake pigment. Moving back to the composition itself, it's obvious the National Gallery picture was not just a reprise of the first version. You can see the pose, gesture, draperies of the angel are substantially different, as was discussed yesterday. The London picture has gilded halos for all the figures apart from the angel, and the infant John the Baptist has his cross depicted in the slight relief of applied gilded tin. These features are absent from the Paris version, and I wonder if they have to do with harmonizing it within the frame that it actually was installed in. As was first noticed by Elisabeth Ravoux at the Louvre, the head of Christ was first based on the reverse cartoon used for the Louvre John the Baptist. You can see in the X-ray it was taken quite far into the painting stage. You can see sliding it over, how it aligns. And then it was changed to this pure profile based on the drawn study. And as we heard about yesterday, the infrared research published by the Louvre shortly after our treatment suggested the relationship of the two works to be much closer than had been appreciated, probably in large part based on using the same basic cartoons as a common starting point. Confusingly, the later London painting retains some of the earlier compositional features, such as the arrangement of the angel's arms, which Bruno described yesterday, changed during the execution of that first picture. The point is, within such a context, the manipulation and recycling of the smaller elements, such as the heads, seems entirely in keeping with his general approach to reusing, adapting, and changing compositional ideas. And you can see more of those changes by looking closely at our picture and also using cross-sections. And they give some indication of the number of revisions that seem to have accompanied the painting as it was stopped and started over its execution. There's a major change to the proper left contour of the Virgin's shoulder and mantle, which you can see with the naked eye, just behind the fingers of her outstretched hand. This pentiment was blocked in using a brown paint, very similar in constitution to that detected in a revision of the Baptist's left foot and the lower part of the Virgin's robe. So there seems to have been a dramatic editing phase, blocking in some new ideas using this brown paint that was then elaborated in varying degrees across the picture. For example, this pentiment has been left just as a bald patch of brown paint applied over the finished mantle, even less resolved than the foot above it. The Baptist's other foot is scarcely more than sketched in. The technique is even more true of the angel's hand. So there are lots of inconsistencies in finish throughout the painting, and it suggests an overall variation in completion that's at least partially the result of expediency rather than some carefully orchestrated artistic intent. It's obviously some sort of mixture of the two, I think. And you can see it in things like the crude blocking in of the sky at the upper right, which is laid in with a layer of ultramarine, and above and around the rocks you see it has none of the gradations that you can see on the left of the picture, where it's very carefully modulated. It also has a very strong and ridged contour on the outside edge, which is strong evidence that it was applied while the picture was in some sort of frame. And that would be consistent with the evidence that it suggests that there was a big push to finish the picture after it was installed in 1503 in the chapel, and a last effort to complete the work after 1506 before it could be paid for. In this case, the visible difference in the quality of the skies passages can be reflected in the paint media. As it happens, on the left, the azurite and ultramarine are in walnut oil, whereas on the right, the ultramarine paint on top of the azurite is in linseed oil, just suggesting, giving more evidence that it's from a very different campaign of painting. This is probably the most easily characterizable example of a lot of inconsistencies in the execution of the picture, some of which result from a lack of finish, while some might suggest participation of collaborators or assistants. And of course, it's very difficult to know whether the appearance of a particular feature is because of one or the other of those reasons. Interpretation is complicated further by changes in paint which are the result of degradation and pigment alteration. For example, evaluating the modeling of the ultramarine drapery. There are cases where the distinction seems pretty easy to characterize. You can see the rather thickly applied orange hair at the top of the Virgin's locks, quite different than the fine silvery highlights at the end. And it's a visual distinction that seems to be echoed in the difference between the angel's hair and that of Christ and the Baptist. Other things I think are less easy to explain. The differences between the Virgin's hands could be explained as the work of different painters or by a lack of completion of the extended hand. The slightly awkward look of the left foot of Christ, which departs considerably from its accomplished underdrawing, could be the result of studio assistance, or it might result from a lack of resolution or completion of the upper form. And I think we have to consider that a certain amount of finishing work was done in the chapel after the painting was installed in 1503. Then the lighting conditions within the chapel itself, which I imagine were less than ideal, might also play a role in the variation of color and brushwork. That's something I think we think about a lot in doing retouching, because the way your retouchings read in different lighting conditions is something that conservators think about a lot. It became clear anyway to us that the traditional model of attribution, which said the figures were Leonardo and everything else was the studio, was a great oversimplification of the evolution of the picture. It may not be possible to determine precisely who painted every detail, or to interpret the intent behind every degree of kind of non-finito element. But of course, it was essential to think about those things when we were retouching, and not to impose a false finish or unrealistic homogeneity. Much of the mid-20th century critical discussion of the National Gallery picture and its technique was deeply concerned with the question of whether it was more or less autograph, and by implication better or worse, than the version in Paris. And I think that's a preoccupation which largely ignores how Leonardo's Milanese studio functioned, or how elastic the concept of primary authorship could be. And this is the part where I think the most recent research and treatments has provided the most interesting insights about how we should think about our painting. Parts of its complicated evolution that seemed very unusual in 2009 now seem much less so. There's a much broader context of other confirmed examples of Leonardo making significant changes during the course of painting, and also sharing aspects of evolving compositions among his associates and collaborators as his work progressed. It seems that Leonardo's workshop was particularly porous, a feature perhaps given impetus by his need to assemble quickly a studio in Milan from a mixture of painters already trained with others more formed by him in the traditional way. It's clear that information has flowed freely between pupils and associates, perhaps most freely of all where compositional ideas were concerned. There are some very interesting technical aspects to this practice which can be seen by looking more closely at the Leonardeschi, where you can see work which ranged from the most superficial, sometimes comical recycling of compositions to a deep engagement with Leonardo's technique and artistic intent. The Yarnwinder composition has been described as leaking from the studio, and it's especially remarkable to see how recent studies demonstrate how versions of lesser quality contain compositional features, like the baby walker, which are often covered in the superior versions, just demonstrating the dissemination of the composition from its earliest conception. And this aspect of the practice of dissemination has been taken further by the study of the St. Anne, where the numerous copies and variants have complemented the knowledge gained from the technical examination of the picture itself, giving a full picture of its evolution. And of course, the most dramatic example of this sort of thing has come from the reappraisal of the Prado Mona Lisa, a painting which seems to have faithfully tracked changes, I think we say, in the evolution of the Louvre painting, but only for part of its lengthy genesis. Returning to our painting, the process of dissemination can be traced even in the abandoned composition. Both this work on the left from the present exhibition attributed to Fernando Llanos and another version which has recently come to light are based on that first compositional idea. They provide fascinating echoes in paint of an abandoned composition, a design which had been thought to have had little wider influence. And so we see yet another example of the spread of works still in progress, and ones which were made many years after the gallery composition had been covered. As I mentioned before, the Citra Armev's fascinating work on the Louvre version of the Virgin of the Rocks provided, again, another important shift in the understanding of our painting, almost immediately after we completed our study. So the sum of all this is that our painting now sits much more comfortably within this wider habit of reuse, adjustment, and in-progress dissemination that's been established with so many other works since we did our treatment. All of this is quite fascinating, but I think that for many the attribution question still looms largest where our painting is concerned, and indeed around the whole business of how collaboration worked. I've described my sense of finding Leonardo not only in the close examination of the best details, but also in his messy creative process, the abandoned composition, the modifications, the delays, the inability to finish, all of which give me a convincing sense of a kind of chaotic authenticity. I also think that John Shearman's description of the careful orchestration of our painting's larger tonal and chromatic relationships is the key to unlocking an appreciation of our picture's quality. He describes significant advances from the Paris painting, which are the consequence of Leonardo's theoretical interest in light and vision as explored in his writings. The systematic exploitation of the strong tonal undermodeling has allowed Leonardo to simulate how our vision fails to perceive color effectively in darker tones, and also gives an understated pictorial unity that is an important shift from the more traditional balancing act of setting intense local colors against one another. The combination of that sophistication in the overall handling with the more puzzling local variations in paint application is therefore central to how we think about quality and authorship. It's been suggested that more than one of the yarn winders would have been understood by contemporaries as by the hand of Leonardo. This, of course, is one model of thinking about the problem. This can be contrasted with other tendencies to unpick the handwriting of each passage of paint and relative isolation to one another in search of very, very precise attributions. And so I wonder just how much consensus exists about what authorship really means in this context, a definition which feels essential to discussing our painting. Staring as we do at paintings for hundreds of hours, our head loops bolted on, we conservators are generally fairly well equipped to try our hand at Morellian comparisons. We usually have a good sense of the uses and implications of technical analysis as well. But there's much more to these questions than these elements, wider considerations which require a much broader cultural contextualization. I think the richness and variety of the papers given in this meeting provides an excellent example of that sort of wider historical perspective. The recent research since our work has shown change, collaboration, and real-time dissemination of ideas to be more common in Leonardo's workshop than had been thought, and this has important implications for the understanding of our work. But there remains much to discuss, and I suspect we are not yet finished, although I am. Thank you very much.